Astonishing new reporting today showing just how lax Trump's top national security advisors have been with classified information, allowing a journalist a front row seat to real-time military planning. Atlantic writer Jeffrey Goldberg details how Trump's own national security advisor, Michael Waltz, added Goldberg to a group chat on the messaging app Signal. The chat included Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio as they planned an attack on Houthi rebels. Goldberg writes this, quote, "The world found out shortly before 2 p.m. Eastern time on March 15th that the United States was bombing Houthi targets across Yemen. I, however, knew 2 hours before the first bombs exploded that the attack might be coming. The reason I knew is that Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, had texted me the war plan at 11:44 a.m. The plan included precise information about weapons packages, targets, and timing." Goldberg's reporting contains back and forth between these cabinet-level officials as they lay out possible plans of attack, including that J.D. Vance considered Trump ill-informed on potential political fallout. Also notable, what Goldberg himself held back to avoid jeopardizing national security. Goldberg writing, quote, "At 11:44 a.m., the account labeled Pete Hegseth posted in Signal a team update. I will not quote from this update or from certain other subsequent texts. The information contained in them, if they had been read by an adversary of the United States, could conceivably have been used to harm American military and intelligence personnel, particularly in the broader Middle East Central Command's area of responsibility. What I will say in order to illustrate the shocking recklessness of this Signal conversation is that the Hegseth post contained operational details of forthcoming strikes on Yemen, including information about targets, weapons the U.S. would be deploying, and attack sequencing." Chillingly, Goldberg's presence in the group chat went completely undetected by its members. They were only made aware when Goldberg reached out before the story went to print. A spokesman for the National Security Council confirming the authenticity of the messages, quote, "This appears to be an authentic message chain, and we are reviewing how an inadvertent number was added to the chain," Brian Hughes, the spokesman for the National Security Council, said. Joining us now, retired four-star general and MSNBC military analyst General Barry McCaffrey. Claire is back with us as well. Barry, just help our viewers understand how significant this breach was.
Well, it's really remarkable. Probably the most sensitive information we have in the armed forces are pending military operations. And in this case, we're talking about the lives of Navy and Air Force flyers. But by the way, we also ought to assume that Signal has been penetrated by many intelligence organizations, to include the Russians and the Iranians. So you're basically putting the lives of U.S. service people at risk. You're also displaying to the Houthis what targets are after, and so they can take measures to disperse or avoid the attack. It's a sense of arrogance. And by the way, I also think it's an attempt to avoid accountability under the Official Records Act. These people have been routinely using Signal, I'll bet you, for many other types of sensitive discussions, knowing they wouldn't be filed and available for researchers or investigators in the coming years. It's really a disgraceful situation. If that had been a bunch of majors and lieutenant commanders coordinating an attack, they'd all get fired and probably be subject to criminal prosecution.
Well, let's talk about the legal consequences, General McCaffrey. Goldberg consulted national security lawyers in the process of writing his piece, and this is what they said, quote, "Waltz, by coordinating a national security-related action over Signal, may have violated several provisions of the Espionage Act. All of these lawyers said that a U.S. official should not establish a Signal thread in the first place. They should go into a specifically designed space known as a sensitive compartmented information facility, or SCIF. Normally, cell phones are not permitted inside a SCIF, which suggests that as these officials were sharing information about an active military operation, they could have been moving around in public. Had they lost their phones or had they been stolen, the potential risk to national security would have been severe." Do you think there should be legal consequences here for this breach?
There needs to be an investigation to find out who's involved. I fear that what will happen is the person that established the threat in the beginning, some low-level functionary in the National Security Council, will get fired or prosecuted. But in fact, they all knew they were on a network that was not secure necessarily. They should all have known that their personal cell phones are undoubtedly being tracked and listened to by multiple foreign intelligence operations. This is just an arrogance left over from probably the political campaign. They thought it was easier to use this system. But again, I've been in and out of the Secretary of Defense office years on end. You lose your telephone in a secure environment well before you get in a protected area. And if it's a pending military operation, most of that would then be classified, need to know, and done only in what you term a SCIF, secure compartmental installation. Costs a fortune to make them. That's where we talk one to another, coordinating military operations.
Claire, ranking member on the Senate Armed Services Committee, Jack Reed, had a pretty blistering statement about this. This is what he said. If true, the story represents one of the most egregious failures of operational security and common sense I have ever seen. Military operations need to be handled with utmost discretion, using approved, secure lines of communication, because American lives are on the line. The carelessness shown by President Trump's cabinet is stunning and dangerous. I will be seeking answers from the administration immediately. What can Democrats in the Senate, in the House, do to actually hold this administration accountable for these breaches of protocol?
Well, they need to be doing more than just statements. If they have to have shadow hearings, if they need to be adamant about getting people in front of the armed services committees to talk about this and the intelligence committees. This is the ultimate disrespect being shown to the warfighter. All of these precautions are in place to protect the men and women who volunteer, who say, you know what, I'll die for my country. I will get in that plane and I will fly and I will drop bombs on the Houthi element because it is in the national security interests of our country. Our job is to protect those men and women who do that. And arrogance is exactly what this is, and it's also ignorance. And by the way, every single person on that text chain knew they were not supposed to be doing that on Signal. Couldn't even wear my Apple Watch into the SCIF. And by the way, Walz knows this. J.D. Vance knows this. He's been in a SCIF before he became vice president. He understands what SCIFs are for. Therefore, learning and talking about things that you do not want our enemies to ever find out. And I just got to say this, Alicia. I mean, really, this is the same bunch of people that were complaining about Hillary Clinton's emails. Are you kidding me? They spent millions of dollars investigating. They couldn't find anything in her emails except maybe one thing that was classified after she sent it. And meanwhile, these guys are giving out war plans, and they don't even know who's on the text chain where they're giving it out. It's so bad.
Well, and General McCaffrey, they did not realize that they had added Jeffrey Goldberg to this chain, that Jeffrey Goldberg was on the chain and watched all of this transpired until he alerts them to it later. I mean, there's the initial breach. There's also just the fact that no one was catching what was happening. No one was auditing in real time. That seems like its own cause for concern. Yeah,
it looks like amateur hour. There's no question about it. And, it's also a sense that, these restrictions, regulations, guidance don't apply to us. We're too senior, when in fact they are the principal targets of foreign intelligence services. And intellectually, they must have known that, but they decided to disregard it. Now, if this had been a purposeful leak by the National Security Council to Jeffrey Goldberg, right now there'd be a massive investigation going on trying to determine who did it. So it's comical that they added a reporter, but it's indicative of a sense of amateur hour that is really shocking at the National Security Council level.
James, let's talk about the government's best argument for convincing the appeals court what they want to do, which is they have the right to invoke this 18th century wartime law, the Alien Enemies Act, and that it has been used appropriately. What will they be saying to this three-judge panel?
Well, the government will be saying, as Lisa just indicated, that the wartime powers granted under the Alien Enemies Act apply in the context of Venezuela and in the context of Tren de Aragua. Now, that is an extraordinary reach. Which is to say 3 times in the nation's history this has been invoked, the War of 1812 and the 2 world wars. Whatever one's view of Tren de Aragua or of foreign relations with Venezuela, we are not in a situation that is remotely analogous to those 3 circumstances. And so, in a sense, this case is either extraordinarily narrow, it's about individualized, granular determinations as to whether the act applies to particular individuals, whether those individuals essentially have what in the Guantanamo enemy combatant context we used to call combatant status review tribunals. The opportunity to have an individualized hearing to determine whether or not the act applies to them. There are individuals and there are attorneys, obviously they have a partisan interest in representing their clients, but who are asserting that individuals who have no relationship whatsoever to Tren de Aragua have been caught up in this, which is why we have due process, even for non-citizens. It may not be the full scope, all the bells and whistles of a trial by jury, certainly not, but the opportunity to have an individualized determination. So the government is arguing, in essence, to really get to the heart of your question, that this is a circumstance in which the foreign government, that Tren de Aragua is essentially a hybrid, indistinguishable from Venezuela's foreign government, and that therefore the act applies. If that argument prevails, then this case is incredibly broad and opens up an extraordinary opportunity for expanded executive power.
But tell me, James, how much will that rely on interpretation of opinion versus hard fact?
It's a good question. And in today's opinion by Judge Boasberg, he actually pulls back from making a judgment for now on whether that is a political question that is beyond the judiciary's reach and is solely the executives. But he says, look, he essentially says that question is one we may have to address down the road, but it's not a clear case. I mean, 75 years since this has been used, this particular act, that's for a reason. We haven't declared war for 75 years. This is to use this act in the current contemporary context is a dramatic expansion of executive authority.
So we've heard multiple officials, Christy, and that includes the president, who's arguing that this man we see on screen, that was Judge James Boasberg, everybody, that he's essentially trying to take the power from the president, usurp it from him, and then help to dictate foreign policy as a result by his rulings, by what he is saying. Is there a legal argument for that, or is this the kind of thing that's being made merely to appeal to the court of public opinion?
The latter.
Okay.
That's an argument for the court of public opinion. Actually, if you look at Judge Boasberg's order from today, he was very careful to say, I'm not actually deciding the issue of whether this proclamation from the president is lawful. That's a thorny, complicated issue. These are hard questions. Even during his hearing, he took pains to say, I'm not deciding on this yet. I may actually come out in the government's favor. I'm not sure. I need more time. I need more briefing on that. But where the law is clear is that these individuals are entitled to due process to decide whether or not they actually fall under the proclamation, whether they are members of this gang. There, the law is clear, and so on that due process ground, I'm going to have these temporary restraining orders continue in place. I'm not going to vacate those. And so it's a very narrow order that, again, is just there to preserve the status quo. That's all he's trying to do. He's not ultimately deciding on the merits yet. This is temporary. And I think he's really taken such pains to, I think, be that narrow, be that clear about the fact that he's not trying to go too far just yet. And so when you see in the media the attorney general referring to him, as a radical left-wing lunatic, and he's trying to take the place of the president and dictate foreign policy, that's just not at all what is going on in that courtroom.
Got it. John, reaching out to you now, because the Time magazine published an account of these experiences of these detainees once they had arrived in El Salvador. Here is part of it. I'm going to read part of it. Here it goes. After being shaved, the detainees were stripped naked. More of them began to whimper. The hard faces I saw on the plane had evaporated. It was like looking at men who passed through a time machine. In 2 hours, they aged 10 years. They entered their cold cells, 80 men per cell, with steel planks for bunks, no mats, no sheets, no pillow, no television, no books, no talking, no phone calls, and no visitors. For these Venezuelans, it was not just a prison they had arrived at. It was exile to another world. So there are going to be many Americans who may read that and say, who cares? They are gang members. They get what they deserve. What do you say to that?
You know, Alex, I think that is one of the most remarkable pieces of this story, and one that I think the court's going to be exploring in further depth as this case goes on. This is not like any deportation I've ever seen before. Typically, the United States, when we deport people, we send them back to their home country. There are times when maybe they've been charged with a crime in their home country and they might get detained, but by and large, we're returning people to their home country where they're then allowed to walk free and return back to their family. In this case, we deported them to a third country, El Salvador, where we knew and had arranged for and arguably paid for their incarceration. I think there are still a lot of questions about the nature of that relationship, under what theories El Salvador are holding them, how long are they being held for. But I think in many ways, that fact alone takes this case. The question is not just whether these migrants were entitled to the basic and more limited due process we provide migrants before we deport them, but whether, and if not, we're bypassing other constitutional rights for them as well, given the fact that the El Salvadorans are incarcerating them at our request. Historically, the INA does allow us to deport people to third countries, but it is very limited, very rarely used. The first Trump administration did it in a completely different way at the Mexico border, where they would return to Mexico certain, non-Mexican nationals who would come into the United States seeking asylum. But I've never seen anything like this, where we've arranged for mass incarceration in a foreign country and return people there without any process at all, knowing, in fact, intending for them to be imprisoned in that country.
So when typically these trips will happen, the deportations, John, they go back to their home countries. I mean, what percentage of deportations, you send them to their home countries, they're repatriated, they've gone through all of the due process, every I is dotted, every T is crossed?
Yeah, Alex, the overwhelming majority of migrants who are in this country, of the 11 to 12 million migrants who are in the United States, the vast majority cannot be deported unless and until an immigration judge has had a hearing. And the reason is, Alex, of course, there might be claims to relief. And that's another question we don't know about these 300 Venezuelans who were deported. Where were they in the process? Almost all of them were certainly asylum seekers. We don't know if any of them have been granted any sort of relief by an immigration court or any sort of protection from deportation. And there's another issue, too, which is that the United States, we do not deport people if they are going to be tortured when they're returned to their home country. So we have we're signed on to the Convention Against Torture, and we extend what's called withholding or removal. So if you're a migrant, you say, hey, look, I have no right to be in this country, but you can't send me back to this country because I'll be tortured there. You can receive a stay of removal, basically, be granted withholding, be allowed to stay in this country. Had these migrants had an opportunity to make that claim, it's very well they might have succeeded given the conditions in the El Salvadoran prison. So again, the rushed nature of this really raises thousands of questions. And because the administration is not giving answers right now, it's really hard to know, how in many ways egregious this process was in terms of the rights that historically would be afforded that were deprived for this particular group.
Christy, to you then, Pam Bondi says this is heading to the Supreme Court. Do you agree with that? And what happens when it gets there?
So it seems certainly like that's where it is headed. One thing that is remarkable to me is that Pam Bondi, as the Attorney General, continues to attack this judge. And if it is going to the Supreme Court, and I agree with her that it probably is, Supreme Court justices, I don't think, like it when you personally attack the district court judges. Judges generally tend to have each other's back, at least with that in
John
that
Roberts
regard.
Doesn't like it.
Right. John Roberts, we saw make a very rare statement saying you shouldn't be talking about impeaching judges. That's not how we deal with disagreement. We deal with disagreement through the appeals process. And so, by continuing to fight this in the court of public opinion, it's really not doing anything to advance this legally, I think. I think if anything, and I expect even at this hearing today, you have 3 judges who are going to look at these filings. And as Judge Boasberg said, the filings, I've never really seen anything like this before. They're really disrespectful. They're really rude, calling this petty mismanagement, and you're fact-finding and you're asking for immaterial facts. Well, that's not really for the litigants to decide. The judge can determine what he thinks is material and what he needs to know about whether a court order has been defied. So you're already kind of putting aside the merits, starting out in a very, I think, you're putting yourself at such a disadvantage by behaving this way. The government is always supposed to be ready, but always supposed to be respectful. And so when this heads to the Supreme Court, I don't know that the government's reception is going to be one that they would expect.
Which brings me to the question to you, James, which is, why do you think they are fighting this act this way so hard? Why not just go through the normal procedures and do it by the book?
It's a really, really good question, and I think it comes down to Machiavellian strategy, which is to say the real challenge, if you are, as the administration clearly is, inclined to, let's say, deport 11 million individuals, the real challenge is one of resources and capacity. And that includes resources and capacity in terms of the immigration judges needed to have those individualized hearings that John was referring to earlier. And so if you can succeed, if the government, the Trump administration can succeed in using the Alien Enemies Act in the way that they are purporting to use it now, then you are basically giving the executive branch carte blanche to get around all of those resource constraints that normally apply. This would be a dramatic expansion of executive authority and a huge reduction in anything resembling a check or a balance.
Joining us now, NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Julie Sirkin, Democratic campaign strategist Faz Shakir, senior advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders, and Susan Page, Washington bureau chief for USA Today. Julie, good morning. What are some Democratic lawmakers saying about the division in the party?
Yeah, hey, good morning, Jose. Well, I just came from a town hall on Friday that Democratic Senator Andy Kim held in New Jersey in a Republican-held district, and I can tell you that the loudest applause from the room, the most energetic the crowd was, came when Kim said that he broke with Leader Chuck Schumer in his vote against keeping the government open and going along with that House-passed continuing resolution that ultimately only that chamber wrote and had an input in. And so Democratic lawmakers are definitely frustrated behind the scenes, not so much that Schumer at the end of the day decided to keep the government open, because there were many who privately felt like that was the right way to go, the right move to make in that moment, but questions certainly surrounding over what strategy or lack thereof that Schumer had going into this process. They don't want to make it so that they are appearing as easily steamrolled heading into the next fight, which is reconciliation, that budget blueprint that Republicans plan to use to fund the president's priorities at the border, mass deportations when it comes to the military, extending those tax cuts. Democrats now are focused on that fight, and Andy Kim himself told me that that is where the Democratic constituents want them to focus, as we heard those very rowdy town halls all over the country while lawmakers were out on recess. Jose.
Yeah, I mean, Faz, you were at the rally over the weekend with Senator Sanders and Representative Cortez. They're drawing tens of thousands of people. It's not an election year. First of all, what is the strategy here, and what is it that the amount of people coming out tell you about what are the concerns and some of the frustrations of folks?
I was honored to organize all 5 of those events across 3 different states, and we had over 86,000 people turn out this weekend. And they're telling you, I think, that the Democratic Party politics right now, which is again encapsulated by a sense of finger in the wind, too cozy with power, don't want to assert power and leverage to fight for our values. That doesn't work for people. Why they're showing up right now for Bernie Sanders, even if they didn't really love him before. This person of integrity who is fighting against a billionaire class and willing to take on that friction with powerful actors. And right now the integrity is lacking from too many politicians who are willing to, when it gets hot against Elon Musk, against billionaires who want to control the economy, are you willing to engage that battle? No finger in the wind, no technocratic politics. a sense of moral virtue. Right now, everything about our country is an obscenity to our moral values. When you see a hubris, an exploitation, a greed that suggests that people's lives don't matter, communities don't matter, people are ahead of the Democratic Party right now. They're showing you, they're turning out in droves to say, you got to catch up to where we're at.
So fast, and if you would explain it to us. So are you saying that there needs to be a change in the performative aspect of what the Democratic Party stands for? Because, and you know, Julie was talking about how behind the scenes, many Democratic legislators say what Schumer did was necessary. It's how he got to doing it, performative, that was a problem.
Yeah. Well, I would argue, so just on Schumer for a moment, Jose, you know, if you are really upset about Social Security offices being closed and veterans clinics being closed unnecessarily, unduly harming America, you draw a red line and you say, Donald Trump, you sit down with us and I will write into this legislation, there will be 0 Social Security office closures in America. And I'm prepared to shut this down unless and until you agree with me on that. So that's just how you exert power. I will say that too often in the Democratic Party, we are looking at politics through a left-right spectrum. That's not where we're at right now. It's a very top versus the rest of us spectrum. And if you don't understand that, if you don't see the class prism and the class dimension and the possibilities of actually talking to, if I looked at a lot of the crowds that showed up, I saw a lot of white working class people who probably voted for Donald Trump. A fair number of them showing up because they felt like they were sold a bill of goods, right? I didn't hear Donald Trump telling me Social Security offices were going to be closed, that Elon Musk was going to come in and raise the entire government, and, you know, CFPB was going to be closed, FTC commissioner is going to be fired. That's not what he campaigned on. So I think I think there's a populist revolt going on through a class-based prism, and that's what you got to see.
And Susan, the newly minted chair of DNC, reported some of the party's strongest grassroots fundraising on record, and this is part of, I guess, I mean, kind of the establishment, $9 million in the first month of Trump's presidency. What are you learning about grassroots efforts? The grassroots is different than the establishment, and yet the establishment seems to be getting support from the grassroots.
You know, if you look at congressional Democrats, they do not have a consistent, coherent strategy against Donald Trump here 60 days into his presidency. And you see all this energy reflected in the big rallies that Senator Sanders got from people in the grassroots. You see it also in these contributions to Democrats. That doesn't mean there's a kind of coherent approach from the grassroots, but there's a great dissatisfaction with the leadership that they're seeing in Washington and an inability to make a constructive and formidable case against Trump and Elon Musk.
You know, Fast, I was curious, and when you were describing and explaining who goes to these rallies, the 80,000 plus people that came out, difficult to generalize, but there clearly is an overwhelming feeling, right, that all of these people share, whether they voted for Trump or not. But how is that translated into what you know, could state is, you know, fighting the oligarchy and the billionaire class? Well, there's an oligarchy and a billionaire class in both political parties.
Yes. Yes, and that, I think, is one of the reasons why people feel a comfort in a sense of solidarity with Bernie Sanders, is that here's someone who has criticized both the Democratic and Republican Party. It didn't just show up today or yesterday. He's been doing it for a long period of time around a core set of moral values. I will say that, Jose, to your point, we went to some places that you would not consider liberal. I mean, you take Altoona, Wisconsin, a town of 2,000 people. We had 5,000 people show up there. Oh, well over that. And then you go out to, it was like 10,000, I think. And then you go out to Greeley, Colorado, University of Northern Colorado there. Very, conservative area. Gabe Evans, congressman, a Republican congressman, represents that district. And you had well over 10,000 people show up there. By strategic design, Senator Sanders has targeted some of these purple districts in America held by Republicans that they won by small margins. Wisconsin, Colorado, Arizona. That's why we visited some of these places. He's arguing, Senator Sanders is, that if we exert this pressure there is a serious possibility that you could peel off Republicans on the Medicaid cuts, the $880 billion that they want to cut from Medicaid, or the giant tax cuts for the rich. That debate is happening this year. And if we're exerting this pressure, you'd have to be a fool if you're, Gabe Evans or Juan Ciscomani or, Derek Van Orden, some of these Republican congressmen who are seeing these giant rallies in their states and not realize what is going on.
Gary, you're also covering this afternoon's arguments in the D.C. Court of Appeals over these deportation flights. What are we expecting there?
Yeah, so this sort of goes on two different tracks here. There's the district court case, and then there's the appeals court case, both on the same topic. Just minutes ago in the district court case, Judge Boasberg said he will not vacate his own ruling as the government had requested him to do. So that means at 1:30 p.m. today, the appeals court will hear the government's plea to vacate the judge's ruling, which had stopped Venezuelan flights from taking off from the U.S., heading to El Salvador under the Alien Enemies Act. This is a hearing where they're going to argue this, and it's going to be really in the weeds. It's going to be pretty a dry legal hearing, but it's, of course, an incredibly important topic. But it's important to note, Judge Boasberg's order did not stop the deportation of Venezuelans outright from this country. Just this weekend, we saw 200 Venezuelans get flown back to Venezuela to the Maduro regime under what they call a repatriation flight that has since been allowed.
And those reportedly had been cases in which there had been at least some adjudication and were not part of this Alien Enemies Act proclamation. Aaron, Attorney General Bondi, though, is talking about this Alien Enemies Act case, looking ahead to the Supreme Court getting involved in this issue. We also learned this weekend that Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem is going to visit the notorious prison in El Salvador where those migrants were sent by President Trump. This is clearly a fight the White House wants to have.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the White House has said as much. We've heard from other members of the administration the same thing, that they believe everything that President Trump has done in these first couple of months of his administration has been legal and proper. All of the executive orders, all the executive actions that have been challenged in courts around the country, really, the Department of Justice has been in court arguing against some of the challenges that we've seen from nonprofit organizations, from unions around the country. And so I think what we heard from the Attorney General over the weekend was that when it comes in particular to this, the Alien Enemies Act that the president has used as a way to deport people that he's alleged are members of gangs, the administration believes this is something that is in their authority, that judges trying to push back on that are really acting on foreign policy issues that are the purview of the president. And so their expectation is that this case will make it to the Supreme Court. And Anna, I think if you look at some of the other cases that are out there as they're going into the appeals process now, we can expect other issues to rise up to the level of the Supreme Court as well in the weeks and months to come.
All right, Aaron Gilchrist and Gary Grumbach, thank you both for the reporting. Michelle, the president keeps on blasting Judge Boasberg in this Alien Enemies Act case. And here was Attorney General Pam Bondi this weekend going after him and other judges by name. Listen.
This is an out-of-control judge, a federal judge trying to control our entire foreign policy, and he cannot do it. Look at Judge Chutkan with the EPA trying to control our money. Judge Chang trying to control the money of the U.S. aid. Judge Reyes, look what she did to Pete Hegseth. She made personal attacks in court about Pete Hegseth, and she's trying to control military readiness. You can't do this. And then, of course, Boasberg trying to control our foreign policy. These judges are out of control.
The posture from the White House is judges can't constrain any executive authority in these cases. So what do you see as the impact of these repeated attacks on the judiciary without any pushback from one party?
The judges, I mean, if you look at the drumbeat of rulings in these cases, the judges do not seem to be intimidated by this. You know, we just heard that the administration is up for the fight. I don't think that the judges necessarily see this as a fight. I think that they see this as them doing their jobs as part of the balance of power in government. There's a larger issue, though, that is at play clearly for the Trump administration, which is to establish absolute executive power. And that's not something that is laid out in our Constitution. That's not something that we've seen. So for the larger American public, there's a bigger issue at stake in terms of our balance of power in our country. in the way that you've seen capitulation in the form of corporate America or law firms or college campuses, you don't expect to see that in the courts. The courts are answering to, as you would say, a different authority here and looking at the rule of law. I don't think we've ever seen an Attorney General of the United States make such a personal attack on judges. There usually is a respect, a camaraderie. Also, like they're on the same team in some respects. But those lines are very fuzzy and very blurry. And on the other hand, you've got judges that are trying to make clear lines of demarcation in terms of the law. And so in each of these cases, there's the case that's at stake, but there's something that's much larger that is at stake, and that is the constitutional issues about the rule of law.
Right. Let's talk about the content of this hearing that's happening today related to deportations to this El Salvadoran prison that's known for human rights abuses. And we have this chilling Time magazine account that was just published over the weekend from a photojournalist who's on the ground there, who was really cataloging the entire intake process from when these detainees arrived last Saturday, a week ago this past Saturday. And he writes this: the intake began with slaps. One young man sobbed when a guard pushed him to the floor. He said, "I am not a gang member. I'm gay. I'm a barber." The reporter then describes the prisoners' heads being shaved, and, quote, "The guy who claimed to be a barber began to whimper, folding his hands in prayer as his hair fell. He was slapped. The man asked for his mother, then buried his face in his chained hands and cried as he was slapped again." And, Michelle, the administration's celebrating this kind of optics that were
Well, the reason we
outlined.
know so much about it is exactly that, the optics. The pictures that were beautifully shot. You work in television. You understand the optics that are at work there. Multiple camera shots, shot with very good cameras and very nice lighting. They wanted to send a message to people. They clearly, this is not a camera person that just happened to be there. That was done with quite a bit of forethought. But the two words that we should focus on are due process. You know, this is something you may think, I don't have a gang member in my family. I don't wear tattoos. I don't have fear of being deported. But if you ever were to get caught up in the criminal justice system for something you did, or maybe something that you were mistakenly, that they thought you did and you didn't, you want to make sure that you have due process afforded to you, to your loved ones, to members of your family or your community. And that's where we see a trampling on that idea of due process in this. And so for people who don't think they have something at stake here, this is a very important issue, whether or not you come from Venezuela, whether or not you are presumed to be a gang member. This should be of concern to every American.
The other thing that just strikes me about just how, that picture was painted is this dehumanization, which is not the first time. And you think that's the point. But you also talk about, no due process. There's no transparency about how the administration determined that these people were who they say they are, gang members in their words, or terrorists also is a word that's been thrown out there. Do you see this as a slippery slope?
Well, it is even in the way that they're describing this, that some of the people, the tattoos seem to be evidence of their gang affiliation.
Just tattoos or a T-shirt.
Or someone who is maybe not in the gang, but has affiliated with the gang. Now, this is something that is used, to be fair, in law. I mean, there's asset forfeiture. If you have been involved in criminal activity in any kind of ancillary way, you could be held responsible. You could be seen as an accomplice. But that is usually determined through judicial review, through process, through due process, through the courts. And if you do, this is one of the reasons why I think they're moving swiftly, because they anticipated that there might be speed bumps along the way, and so they moved swiftly to make sure that they could do this without questioning. And so, yes, there is a very slippery slope here.
Michelle Norris, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having
really
me.
appreciate it.